There are fears we speak about openly, and then there are the ones we never mention. The fears we bury so deeply inside of ourselves that even we forget they exist. And yet, they still guide our choices, they still shape our relationships, and they still linger in the background of our daily lives like silent shadows. Repressed fear is not the kind of fear that makes you scream, run, or panic. It's the kind of fear that whispers, the kind that hides in the pauses between your words, the kind that influences you without you ever realizing it. And sometimes the most powerful force in our lives is not what we see clearly, but what we've worked hardest to push away. Let me ask you something. Have you ever noticed how sometimes you avoid certain conversations without even knowing why? Or how you keep hesitating to take a step forward in life even though there's no visible obstacle? It's almost as if an invisible wall is there, one you can't quite explain. This is the work of repressed fear. It doesn't scream at you, it quietly redirects you. It's not obvious, it hides inside habits, hesitations, and subtle choices. And over time, these little detours can change the entire direction of your life. Psychologists have studied repression for decades, and one thing has become clear: the mind has an extraordinary ability to protect itself. When we experience something that feels overwhelming or threatening, our brain has defense mechanisms. One of the strongest of these is repression. We push the fear into the unconscious so we don't have to face it. On the surface, it looks like the problem is gone, but underneath, it's still alive. The human psyche is like an iceberg. Most of what shapes us is underwater, hidden from sight. But here's where it becomes dangerous. A repressed fear doesn't vanish. It disguises itself. It shows up in other ways, like procrastination, perfectionism, overthinking, or even physical symptoms, such as constant tension in the body. You might find yourself endlessly scrolling through your phone at night, not because you're entertained, but because something inside of you resists silence. That silence feels like it would reveal too much. And so, you keep moving, you keep distracting, you keep running, even when there is nowhere to go. Why does this happen? The answer lies in how the human brain is wired. Fear is a survival mechanism. From an evolutionary perspective, fear kept us alive. It made us cautious. It alerted us to danger. It pushed us to prepare. But when a fear becomes overwhelming or inescapable, the brain chooses another path. It hides it away. Repression is not a flaw. It's actually a strategy. The problem is that strategies built for survival don't always work for growth. A child who represses fear to survive a difficult environment may grow into an adult who keeps doing the same thing, even when that fear is no longer useful. Repressed fear often shapes itself into patterns. Imagine someone who, as a child, feared rejection or abandonment. They might repress that fear, never acknowledging how deeply it hurt them. But as an adult, that same hidden fear might drive them to avoid intimacy, or cling too tightly to relationships, or sabotage their own happiness before someone else has the chance to leave. The fear isn't visible, but the behaviors it produces are. And the most painful part is that often we don't recognize its fear at all. We say, "I'm just not ready yet." We say, "I just don't like taking risks." We say, "That's not really for me." But underneath, the truth may be that fear is pulling the strings. And until we face it, that invisible hand continues to steer us. Think about this. How many dreams have been left unfulfilled, not because of lack of talent or opportunity, but because of unspoken fear? How many words were never said? How many steps were never taken because of something too painful to look at directly? History itself is filled with lives that were shaped not only by courage, but by what was hidden in silence. Psychology has a term for when unresolved fear disrupts our present life. It's called unconscious avoidance. It means that instead of confronting the fear directly, the mind keeps finding ways to dance around it. Maybe you avoid certain places. Maybe you avoid certain kinds of people. Or maybe you avoid opportunities that could change your life. You tell yourself it's about practicality, or timing, or preference. But beneath all of that, there may be an old fear waiting, unaddressed. But repression is not only about avoidance. Sometimes repressed fear flips into its opposite. A person who secretly fears failure might become obsessed with achievement, chasing success endlessly, not for joy but as a shield. A person who represses the fear of being powerless might develop controlling behaviors, constantly needing to prove they're in charge. What looks like strength on the outside may, in reality, be a defense against the fear that was never allowed to surface. Here's something else worth noticing. Repressed fear doesn't just shape individuals, it shapes societies. Think about how entire cultures develop taboos around certain subjects. Sometimes it's not just one person repressing, but whole groups collectively avoiding certain truths, and in that silence, fear grows stronger. The same way an individual can be guided by repressed fear, whole communities can be shaped by what they refuse to face. There's a paradox at the heart of repression. The more you avoid fear, the more power it has. But the moment you begin to acknowledge it, even in the smallest way, it starts to lose its grip. Fear thrives in darkness, but it weakens when brought into the light of awareness. Yet for many people, even that first step feels impossible. After all, who wants to admit that the thing steering their choices is not strength, but a buried fear? But here's the truth. Repressed fear is not a sign of weakness. It's a sign of humanity. Every single person carries fears they cannot fully admit. Every single person has shadows that shape them. To repress fear is simply to be human. The real question is not whether you repress fear, but whether you're willing to notice its presence. And this is where it gets deeply personal. If you slow down, if you truly look at your life with honesty, you might begin to see the traces. Why do you always hesitate at the last moment when an opportunity presents itself? Why do you avoid certain people, even when you can't explain why? Why do you keep finding reasons not to do the very thing you know could change your life? Behind these patterns may live a repressed fear waiting to be acknowledged. When Sigmund Freud first introduced the idea of repression, he was describing how the mind pushes unbearable thoughts into the unconscious. But modern psychology has shown that repression is not just about thoughts, it's about emotions too, especially fear. Fear is a powerful emotion, and when it is buried, it doesn't just stay locked away. It seeps into how we speak, how we love, how we work, how we dream. It becomes a quiet undertone to our entire existence. Yet the paradox remains. What we resist persists. The more we push fear down, the more it demands to be felt. It shows up in restless sleep, in anxious habits, in the strange sense that something is missing even when life looks fine from the outside. And so, repressed fear becomes both the protector and the prison. It saves us from immediate pain, but it also holds us back from deeper freedom. What makes this subject so moving is that it's not just theory. Every person listening right now has lived this in some way. Maybe you feel a tightness in your chest when someone mentions commitment. Maybe you change the subject quickly when someone talks about loss. Maybe you avoid quiet moments because the silence feels heavier than it should. These are not random quirks. These may be the fingerprints of repressed fear. And this leads us to an essential question. If fear can be repressed so deeply, how can we ever truly understand ourselves? The answer may be uncomfortable, but also liberating. You don't need to dig endlessly into the past. You don't need to uncover every hidden memory. Sometimes the key is much simpler. Pay attention to your present. Watch your hesitations. Watch your escapes. Watch the patterns of avoidance that appear in your daily life. Because fear leaves a trail. It always leaves a trail. And once you begin to see that trail, you can begin to understand the invisible forces guiding you. And maybe, for the first time, you realize that the thing you thought was just who you are might actually be the echo of a fear you've carried for years. Repressed fear is not always easy to face because it does not appear with a clear name tag. It doesn't introduce itself by saying, "Here I am fear." Instead, it disguises itself in subtle ways. It becomes hesitation. It becomes the sudden change of subject when a conversation gets too close to the truth. It becomes the restless energy that makes you busy with endless tasks, avoiding the stillness that would bring those hidden emotions to the surface. And if you look closely enough, you'll see that many of the struggles in daily life are not just about time or luck or circumstance. They are about fear, specifically the fear we refuse to acknowledge. Think about the person who keeps saying they want to write a book but never does. On the surface, they may say they don't have time, but underneath, the deeper truth might be a repressed fear of exposure, of being judged, of discovering they're not as capable as they imagined. Or consider the person who avoids love, not because they don't desire connection, but because buried within them is an old fear of abandonment that still feels unbearable. On the outside, their reasons may sound logical. On the inside, a hidden fear holds the strings. This is where philosophy and psychology meet. Great thinkers across centuries have said that the unexamined life leads to suffering, and one of the greatest forms of this unexamined life is the life shaped by repressed fear. It's like being steered by a map you never got to see. You think you are choosing freely, but in reality, invisible roads have already been drawn. Modern neuroscience has added even more layers to this. We now know that fear leaves physical imprints in the body. The amygdala, the part of the brain responsible for fear processing, doesn't just switch off when we repress something. Instead, the body holds on to the memory, even when the conscious mind tries to forget. This is why some people experience unexplained anxiety or physical tension that doesn't make sense. The body remembers what the mind tries to bury. Repressed fear is not only psychological, it's physical. But there is also hope here, because just as the mind and body hold on to fear, they also hold the capacity for healing. When a repressed fear begins to surface, it may feel overwhelming at first. You might feel the rush of emotion, the discomfort of uncertainty, the shaking of old defenses. But with awareness and compassion, that same fear can transform. What was once an invisible chain can become a source of wisdom. The question is, how do we begin that process? How do we move from repression to understanding without being swallowed by the very fear we tried to hide? The first step is curiosity, not the curiosity of judgment, not the curiosity of trying to fix yourself, but a gentle curiosity about your own life. When you notice yourself avoiding something, pause and ask, what am I really afraid of here? Not the surface answer, not the practical excuse, but the deeper truth. Sometimes even naming the fear begins to loosen its grip. The second step is patience. Repressed fear does not unravel overnight. It has been living inside you for years, maybe decades. To expect it to dissolve quickly is like expecting a tree to uproot itself in a single day. Instead, it requires gradual awareness, small steps, and the willingness to return to the question again and again. Each time you catch yourself hesitating, escaping, or resisting, you have another chance to notice. Over time, noticing itself becomes healing. The third step is compassion. This part is essential. When repressed fear surfaces, it often brings shame with it. You might think, why am I still afraid of this? Why can't I be stronger? But compassion changes the story. It reminds you that repression was never weakness. It was protection. It was your mind's way of keeping you safe when you didn't have the tools to deal with that fear. By showing compassion, you create space for the fear to exist without taking over. And in that space, healing begins. But there's something deeper here too. Repressed fear can become not just a personal obstacle, but a doorway to self-discovery. Because fear reveals what we value most. If you fear rejection, it means you value love. If you fear failure, it means you value growth. If you fear loss, it means you value connection. Beneath every repressed fear is something precious you are trying to protect. When you uncover the fear, you also uncover the treasure it was guarding. There's a beautiful paradox in all of this. The very thing we avoid has within it the key to our growth. The fear you repress is not just a shadow, it's also a signal. It's pointing toward the part of you that longs to expand. Facing it may feel like death at first, but in truth it's more like a rebirth. Each time you allow yourself to acknowledge a hidden fear, you reclaim a part of yourself that was lost. Consider this. A child who represses the fear of being unheard may grow up avoiding expression, never speaking their truth. But when that person finally turns toward the fear and acknowledges it, they don't just release the fear, they discover their voice. Or the person who represses the fear of abandonment may live years avoiding closeness, but when they finally allow that fear into the light, they also rediscover the courage to love. Repressed fear is both the wound and the invitation. And here is something to remember. You don't need to fight fear. You don't need to conquer it or destroy it. Fear is not your enemy. It's a messenger, a very persistent messenger. The more you try to silence it, the louder it finds ways to speak. But if you listen, if you really listen, you begin to realize that fear is trying to tell you something about what matters most in your life. What makes repressed fear so powerful is not the fear itself, but the silence around it. The silence gives it strength. The silence gives it control. Breaking that silence, even quietly, even privately, is the beginning of freedom. That could be as simple as writing down what you're afraid of, or speaking it out loud to yourself, or sharing it with someone you trust. The act of naming the fear, even imperfectly, brings it out of the dark and into the light. And in that light, fear begins to change. Philosophers often said that courage is not the absence of fear, but the willingness to act in spite of it. But what they rarely mention is that the courage to face repressed fear is one of the greatest acts of self-respect. It's not about becoming fearless. It's about refusing to let hidden fear decide the shape of your life. As you reflect on this, consider the subtle places in your own life where fear may be hiding, the opportunities you've delayed, the conversations you've avoided, the emotions you've numbed. What would happen if, instead of turning away again, you turned gently toward them? What would happen if, for once, you allowed yourself to feel what has been waiting beneath the surface all along? Perhaps the most moving truth is this: everyone you know is carrying repressed fears, even the people who look confident, even the people who seem untouchable, even the people you admire. Behind every mask is a human being who has hidden their own shadows. Realizing this doesn't just bring compassion for yourself, it brings compassion for others, because you begin to see that beneath all the armor, we are all afraid of something. So maybe the purpose of life is not to eliminate fear, but to transform our relationship with it, to no longer see it as a chain, but as a teacher, to no longer bury it in silence, but to allow it to remind us of what we value. And in doing so, we stop being prisoners of repressed fear and become students of it. One day, you will look back and realize that the things you were most afraid of never defined you. What defined you was the courage to face them. What defined you was the willingness to stop running. And what defined you more than anything else was the choice to live honestly, even with the shadows. So tonight, when the world becomes quiet and the distractions fade away, ask yourself, what am I still afraid to face? And whatever answer arises, remember, it's not there to destroy you. It's there to guide you back to yourself. And that may be the greatest secret of all. The fears we repress are not just barriers, they are invitations. Invitations to become more whole, more free, and more alive than we ever imagined.